The alarm went off at 6:40, same as it had for 2 years, and same as always, I didn't hear the first 4 minutes of it. By the time I actually opened my eyes, it was 6:52, which left 18 minutes to become a functioning person and get to a job that started at 7:15 with a 20-minute walk between here and there. I want to say this was unusual. It was Tuesday. It was every Tuesday. My eyes were open, technically. My body had made a unilateral decision without consulting me. The same decision it made most mornings, which was to lie there a few more seconds and let 18 minutes quietly become 12. I don't think I'd ever once, in 2 years, woken up and thought, today, I'll get ahead of it. The alarm was more of a suggestion by that point, the way you eventually stop hearing a smoke detector that's always going off for no real reason. I got there at 7:31. My supervisor didn't say anything, which was somehow worse than if he had, because it meant this had stopped being a conversation and started being a pattern he was just keeping a mental file on. I spent the first hour of every shift a little out of breath and a lot out of patience with myself, and told myself that was just what mornings were like for people like me. 4 minutes shy of an actual write-up, which is its own strange kind of achievement. Technically fine, spiritually not fine at all. Nobody handed me a form that morning. Nobody needed to. The look on his face did the paperwork for both of us, and I carried it around under my ribs for most of the shift like a small, familiar weight I'd stopped noticing was even there. Weekdays weren't even the part that bothered me most looking back. It was the weekends. I'd tell myself Saturday was for catching up, and then wake up around 11. And by the time I actually got moving, it was early afternoon, and somehow the whole day had already decided what kind of day it was going to be without asking me. I lost entire Saturdays to nothing in particular. Not rest exactly, just absence. My apartment wasn't bad exactly. It was just permanently behind. Dishes behind, laundry behind, a stack of mail behind. That I opened in the order things got urgent instead of the order they arrived. I told myself I'd catch up on a weekend that never actually showed up empty enough to catch up in. There's a specific kind of tired where cleaning a kitchen counter feels less like 10 minutes of effort and more like a decision you don't currently have the resources to make. I wasn't dramatic about it. I just quietly stopped expecting the apartment to look like someone lived there on purpose. Dinner most nights was whatever required the least number of decisions. Eaten standing at the counter, next to a small stack of bills I was current on but never ahead of. Current felt like the ceiling, not the floor. I didn't know yet that there was a difference. I paid everything on time, mostly. That was the whole scoreboard I was tracking. Not overdue, not behind, not in trouble. Nobody tells you that not in trouble and actually going somewhere are two completely different games, and you can spend years winning the first one while never even entering the second. I worked loading dock shifts at a distribution warehouse, on my feet 8, sometimes 10 hours, and by the time I got home, the version of me that could have done something useful with an evening had already clocked out somewhere around hour 6. I wasn't lazy. I was just always reacting to whatever the day had already decided to do to me. I want to be clear, I'm not looking for sympathy about the job itself. It paid the bills, mostly, and plenty of people work harder for less. It's just that reactive is an exhausting way to live even when nothing's technically going wrong. You can be busy every single hour and somehow never once feel like you're actually moving. There was a supervisor posting on the break room board for about 3 weeks. Better pay, a real schedule instead of rotating shifts, the kind of job that actually let you plan a life around it instead of just surviving whatever hours you got handed. Applications closed at 7 a.m. sharp on a Friday, in person, first come, actually mattered kind of first come, because they were only interviewing the first 6 people who showed up with a completed form. I did the math on it more than once that week. $3.50 an hour more, which doesn't sound like much until you multiply it out. Almost $7,000 a year I wasn't currently having. $7,000 is a car that doesn't need constant repairs. It's not flinching when the fridge dies. I wasn't dreaming about a different life. I was doing arithmetic on a slightly less exhausting version of the one I already had. I woke up at 7:04 that Friday. 4 minutes doesn't sound like anything until it's the exact 4 minutes standing between you and a life that pays different. I got there at 7:22 with the form filled out in the elevator, and the woman at the desk was polite about it in the specific way. People are polite when the answer is already no. I stood in the parking lot afterward for a minute longer than I needed to, holding a completed form nobody was going to read, doing that thing where you replay the 4 minutes over and over like reruns might eventually change the ending. They didn't. I drove to my actual shift and clocked in on time that day, which felt like a joke somebody else would have found funnier than I did. There was a dock supervisor named Pete who'd been there almost 20 years, and I'd never once seen him rushed. Never running in, never apologizing to a time clock, coffee already in hand like he'd had time to make it somewhere that wasn't his kitchen sink standing up. I used to think some people were just built calmer. I didn't yet think it might be a decision instead of a personality. I'd worked near Pete for over a year without really seeing him, the way you stop noticing a piece of furniture that's just always been there. It took losing something I actually wanted to make me start paying attention to the guy who seemed to have already solved whatever problem I was currently drowning in. A few days after the posting closed, I finally just asked him. Not about the job, about him. How he was always like that. He kind of laughed, like it was a strange thing to ask, and said, "I've been getting up at 5 for about 15 years. Everything else is just what's left over after that." I remember feeling almost let down by the answer, like I'd been hoping for something more complicated than a wake-up time. 15 years is longer than I'd had most jobs. It was strange to think the calmest person I knew had built it out of something that ordinary, repeated for that long. I asked what he even did with an extra 2 hours nobody was making him use. He said most of it wasn't interesting. Coffee, a walk, some reading, going over the day before the day started going over him. Said the actual hard part was never the 2 hours. It was getting out of bed for them in the first place, and that most people quit around day 4, so if I tried it, don't be surprised when day 4 felt like the whole idea was stupid. He said it so plainly, like he was warning me about weather, not offering advice. I remember thinking, sure, day 4, easy. I'd been getting up on time for a job for years. How hard could getting up on time for myself be? I didn't yet understand those were completely different muscles. That night, I set my alarm for 5 a.m. for the first time in my adult life, with the specific, slightly embarrassing confidence of someone who has never actually tried a thing yet. I pictured myself calm, coffee in hand, Pete adjacent. I even laid out clothes, which felt very organized and adult of me, like I was preparing for a job interview instead of a version of myself that didn't exist yet. I fell asleep proud of a morning I hadn't had. I woke up at 6:41. My alarm had gone off at 5, apparently, according to the little log on my phone, for 11 straight minutes, and I have no memory of any of it. Day 1 lasted about 4 seconds of actual consciousness before my body vetoed the entire plan without consulting me. The clothes I'd laid out the night before just sat there on the chair looking a little ridiculous in the morning light, like evidence from a trial I'd already lost. I got up at my regular time and went through a regular Tuesday and didn't tell anyone I'd even tried. Pete had said day 4. I didn't even make it to day 2 the normal way, so I changed the actual mechanics of the thing. Moved my phone charger clear across the room, so turning off the alarm required standing up, which apparently is 90% of the entire battle nobody warns you about. It felt almost too simple to count as a real strategy. I'd expected the fix to be about willpower, some internal resolve I clearly didn't have enough of. Instead, it turned out to mostly be architecture, just making the easy things slightly less easy and the hard things slightly less hard, until they were closer to the same size. I wrote the promotion posting's closing time on a sticky note, 7 a.m. sharp, and put it right where the alarm now lived. So the first thing I'd see standing there half asleep was the exact number that had already cost me once. It wasn't inspirational. It was just annoyingly specific, which turned out to matter more. Vague goals are easy to negotiate with at 5 in the morning. A specific number written in my own handwriting was a lot harder to argue my way around, even half-conscious, even standing in the dark, not fully sure what year it was yet. I told my mom about it mostly by accident. She asked why I sounded tired, and I just said I was trying to start getting up earlier. She didn't make a big thing of it, just said, "Well, let me know how day 4 goes." Which was strange because I hadn't mentioned Pete's day 4 line to her at all. Apparently everyone who's ever tried this already knows about day 4. I just didn't yet. Having someone who'd ask made it slightly harder to quietly let it go. The next 5 a.m., the alarm went off, and out of pure momentum from crossing the room to silence it, I just stayed up, stood there in the dark for a solid minute, genuinely unsure what to do with a version of the day nobody had scheduled for me yet. It's a strange, specific kind of disoriented, being upright and awake with absolutely nothing demanding anything of you yet. No supervisor, no clock to beat, no bus to catch. Just me, standing in a dark room, holding 2 free hours I had genuinely never had before and had no idea yet what to do with. I made coffee at 5:11 a.m., sat at my kitchen table in the dark because I hadn't even thought to turn a light on, and watched my own street slowly go from black to gray to a version of blue nobody sees when they're rushing out the door at 6:52. It wasn't profound. It was just quiet in a way my mornings had never once been. I didn't have a plan for those first 2 hours. I mostly just sat there, a little stunned by how different the same street looked when I wasn't sprinting past it. I think that was the actual first win. Not anything I did, just noticing there was a whole version of the morning I'd never once been awake for. I didn't have some elaborate morning routine plan because I'd have talked myself out of anything that required equipment or motivation I didn't have yet. It started as almost nothing. Cold water on my face, standing at the sink, mostly just to prove to my own body that we were actually doing this. It sounds like a small thing to build a habit around, and it was. That was sort of the point. I wasn't trying to become a different person overnight. I was just trying to get through the first 90 seconds without going back to bed, and cold water turned out to be a genuinely effective argument my half-asleep brain couldn't easily talk its way around. Then I started walking just around the block before the sun was fully up, mostly because sitting still at 5:15 a.m. made it too easy to go back to bed. 15 minutes, same route, past the same closed-up shops, and somewhere in there my head would just quiet down in a way it never got the chance to during the actual chaos of a normal day. I passed the same closed bakery every morning, the same guy walking the same dog, and there was something steadying about a small routine repeating itself back to me before the rest of the world had even properly started. Nothing about the walk itself was impressive. It just gave the day a beginning I'd actually chosen, instead of one that got dropped on me at 6:52. I picked up a book I'd owned for 2 years and never opened, and read maybe 10 pages a morning, which sounds small enough to be pointless. It wasn't about the book. It was 10 minutes of my brain doing something on purpose instead of just absorbing whatever the day threw at it first. I finished that book in about 6 weeks, which felt like a strange kind of accomplishment for something that took 10 minutes a day and involved zero effort of willpower once I was actually sitting there. It made me start wondering what else I'd been assuming was too hard for me. That was really just something I'd never given 10 quiet minutes to. Before I left for my shift, I started writing down 3 things, just 3, that I actually wanted to get done that day, separate from whatever the warehouse needed from me. Most days I still only got through one of them. One was still more than 0, which had basically been my average for years. Some mornings the 3 things were tiny. Call the landlord back, look up that certification, actually go to bed on time. It didn't matter how small. The list existing at all meant I'd decided something about my own day before the day had a chance to decide it for me. The real test wasn't a weekday. It was the first Saturday when nothing was making me get up at all. No shift, no clock, nobody's expectations but my own. I almost didn't. Lying there, I could feel the old logic creeping back in, the one that said Saturdays were for sleeping in because I'd earned it. I got up anyway, and it was the closest thing to proof I had that this wasn't just a work schedule trick. It was actually becoming who I was. About 3 weeks in, I showed up to my shift 11 minutes early for the first time maybe ever. Not rushed, not out of breath. Just early, the way Pete always was, standing there with actual time to spare instead of time I'd stolen from somewhere else. I remember standing by the time clock those extra 11 minutes not quite knowing what to do with myself. The same disoriented feeling from that first 5 a.m. morning, just relocated to a parking lot. Being early was so unfamiliar it almost felt like I was doing something wrong. A coworker I'd worked next to for over a year finally said something. You're different lately. What happened? I didn't really have a clean answer yet. I just said I'd started getting up earlier. He looked at me like that couldn't possibly be the whole explanation. It mostly was. I remember feeling a little embarrassed about how simple it sounded said out loud, like I was supposed to have a better story than I set an alarm and moved my phone charger. There wasn't a better story. Sometimes the whole explanation really is that small, and it just doesn't feel like enough to say out loud yet. Nobody gave me an award for showing up on time. That was never really the point. The point was, I noticed it myself every single morning before anyone else had the chance to notice anything, and that was a completely new kind of proof that I could actually keep a promise to myself. I'd spent a long time collecting small, quiet evidence that I probably couldn't. This was the first stretch of weeks collecting the opposite kind, and it turned out that evidence adds up just as fast either direction. You just don't notice it building until you look back and there's a whole pile of it. About 2 months in, I got hit with a bad flu, the kind that makes 9 p.m. feel like an accomplishment. The 5 a.m. thing quietly stopped mattering for about a week, the way anything reasonably does when your body is busy with something bigger. That part didn't bother me at all, honestly. Resting when you're actually sick isn't a failure of discipline, it's just being a person with a body. I want to be clear about that distinction because what happened next was a completely different problem, and it took me a while to notice the difference myself. The problem was, the week after I felt better, I still didn't get up. Then the week after that. 2 solid months of mornings, undone in about 12 days, and the sticky note with 7 a.m. sharp on it just sat there next to an alarm I'd started sleeping through again like none of it had ever happened. It's strange how fast the new normal can lose to the old one when you're not actively defending it. I wasn't deciding to quit exactly. I just stopped choosing to continue, one snoozed alarm at a time, until stopped choosing quietly became the new default all over again. A guy at work half joked, "Guess the whole 5 a.m. thing didn't stick, huh?" Not even meanly, just observationally, the way people notice when you quietly stop being the version of yourself you'd started being. It landed harder than it should have, mostly because he wasn't wrong. One night, I actually opened my alarm settings and sat there for a while, thumb over the toggle, seriously considering just deleting the whole thing. Not skipping a day, deleting it, admitting it had been a phase like a lot of other phases I'd started and quietly let go of. I told myself it didn't even matter that much. I hadn't gotten the job. Maybe none of it had actually been leading anywhere real, and I'd just been performing discipline at nobody in particular. I ended up telling Pete about it, expecting something like disappointment. He just shrugged and said falling off wasn't the part that mattered. Everybody falls off, including him, more than once over 15 years. The only real question was whether I was going to treat it like proof I couldn't do this, or just get back up tomorrow and start the count over. He said something else that stuck with me more than the rest of the conversation. That the version of him who'd stuck with it for 15 years wasn't the version who'd never quit. It was the version who'd quit a handful of times and started again anyway, until starting again stopped feeling like a big deal and just became the next normal thing to do. So the next morning, at 5 a.m., sore from 2 months of momentum I'd have to rebuild almost from nothing, I got up anyway. It felt worse than the very first time, honestly. My body had gotten comfortable with quitting almost as fast as it had gotten used to the routine. I stood at the sink again with the cold water back at day 1 and told myself day 1 twice wasn't the same as never starting. This time, I gave the mornings an actual job to do. I found out the supervisor role required passing an internal logistics certification, so instead of just reading whatever, I spent 20 minutes a morning going through the study material for that exact test before my shift even started. Having a specific target made the whole habit easier to protect, oddly enough. It's harder to talk yourself out of 20 minutes when there's an actual test at the end of it, versus 20 minutes of vaguely self-improving. I wasn't just proving I could get up early anymore. I was building towards something with an actual shape to it. It wasn't fast. Some mornings I understood maybe half of what I read and had to go over it again the next day. But 20 minutes a day, most days for a few months, adds up to something that looks a lot like actually learning a subject, even if no single morning ever felt like progress on its own. The stack of notes on my kitchen table went from a few loose pages to something thick enough to need a binder, and I genuinely couldn't tell you which specific week that happened. It just accumulated quietly, the same way the debt in these stories always seems to build. Except this time it was building in a direction I actually wanted. I started noticing things on shift I used to just follow orders about. Why a route got scheduled a certain way, why some loads got flagged and others didn't. Understanding the reasons behind the job I'd been doing on autopilot for 2 years made the job itself feel different, even before anything official had changed. One morning I caught a scheduling error before it turned into a delayed shipment. Small thing, maybe saved an hour, nothing anyone would remember by Friday. But it was the first time I'd actually used what I was learning instead of just absorbing it, and my supervisor's brief, mildly surprised good catch was the first purely professional compliment I think I'd gotten in about 2 years. 6 months after the first posting I'd missed by 4 minutes, a second supervisor position opened up on the same board. This time, I already had the certification sitting finished in a folder, 3 weeks before the posting even went up, because I hadn't been waiting for a deadline to tell me when to start. Applications for this one opened at 7 a.m. too. I got there at 6:15, first in line, in the dark, with Pete's coffee already in hand energy I'd apparently absorbed somewhere along the way without noticing. Nobody had to tell me to be early. Early had just quietly become who I was on a Tuesday. I got the job, not because I was the most experienced person who applied. A couple of people had more years than me. I think it was because I was the only one who showed up with the certification already done, and 45 minutes of margin nobody asked for, which said something about how I actually operate that a resume couldn't have said on its own. I called my mom from the parking lot before I even got in my car. She asked if this meant I could finally stop with that whole 5 in the morning thing. Half joking. I told her no. If anything, this was the proof it was worth keeping. She got quiet for a second and then just said she was proud of me, which is a sentence I don't think I'd heard directed at me in a long time, and I hadn't realized how much I'd missed hearing it. My first morning as a supervisor, I got up at 5 a.m. out of habit, made coffee, sat at the same kitchen table, and realized the sticky note was still there. 7 a.m. sharp. Years past being useful information. Kept anyway. The way you keep the first dollar a business ever made. It wasn't about that specific deadline anymore. It just reminded me what I'd been like before I decided to be someone who wasn't late for his own life. People ask about the money difference, and there was one. Better pay, an actual schedule, the kind of stability that changes what your Sunday nights feel like. But the money was never really the thing that changed. The thing that changed is I stopped being a person things happened to before 7 a.m. and became a person who'd already decided what kind of day it was going to be before the world got a vote. It's been a little over a year now. The mornings don't feel like an accomplishment anymore, most days. They just feel like Tuesday, which is exactly what Pete meant, I think, when he said everything else is just what's left over after 5. I still walk the same block sometimes. The bakery's still closed when I pass it. Some things are supposed to stay the same so you can actually notice the things that didn't. If you're where I was, the honest version is this. It's not really about 5 a.m. specifically. It's about picking one thing at a time nobody's forcing you to want, and proving to yourself, quietly, privately, with nobody watching or clapping, that you'll actually do it. Everything else I built came after that. None of it would have happened first.